Shalom TV presents the Adolf and Ruth Schnurmacher Lecture from Fairfield University, the Carl and Dorothy Bennett Center for Judaic Studies. Rabbi Eric H. Yoffie, President Emeritus of the Union for Reform Judaism, and columnist, the Jerusalem Post and Haaretz. American Jews look at a changing Israel, peace, prosperity, and religious pluralism.
It's not easy to get a sense of what is happening in Israel right now. What's the mood? What's the situation on the ground? What are Israelis feeling and thinking? Conventional wisdom is likely to be, this is an exceedingly grim time for the Jewish state. To talk about Israel is not to share tales of joy. The neighborhood, after all, is in utter turmoil. What was once called the Arab Spring has not turned out to be so spring-like. In the entire Arab world, there's not a single country to which we would normally apply the word enlightened as we use it in the Western sense. In Egypt, the largest Arab nation, a military coup has turned out a democratically elected government, which was itself largely incompetent and hugely unpopular. Terror continues in Egyptian-controlled Sinai. Syria is racked by a terrible and bloody civil war. Syrian refugees are streaming into Jordan and Turkey and Iraq, millions of refugees, about 2 million altogether, threatening the stability of those countries. And it's been demonstrated beyond any doubt that President Assad has used chemical weapons against his own people. In Lebanon, Hezbollah, which is the dominant military force there and an ally of Iran, has committed its militia to Assad's defense. The American response to all of this has been uncertain. And meanwhile, the threat of an Iranian nuclear weapon remains, although maybe there's a ray of hope in that regard. The conclusion, well, Israel is threatened from every direction, its situation hugely precarious. At least that's what we might conclude from reading the press, to listening to many Jewish leaders. Doesn't seem to be a terribly unreasonable conclusion. On the other hand, sometimes we in the Jewish world have a tendency to be traffickers in apocalypse. The problem with this conclusion is I'm not sure that it reflects reality, which is far more nuanced and complicated than the picture might suggest. What I'd like to do this evening is to present to you a more balanced view, perhaps, of Israel's situation and suggest why, amidst understandable concern, there might be reason for a more hopeful view of Israel's current reality. And the first thing to be said is this. Israel is cutting its defense budget by about $1 billion. It's cutting its defense budget by about $1 billion. The overall defense budget of Israel is about $15 billion, so it's a significant cut, both in absolute terms and in percentage terms. In many ways, Israel is stronger now than it has ever been. Why is that? Because for 65 years, Israel's defense strategy has been based on preparing for the worst-case scenario conventional war. That is, Egyptian armies pouring over the border with Sinai from the south, Syrian armies pouring over the border from the north, Iraqi armies coming through Jordan from the east. A version of this is what happened in the Yom Kippur War 40 years ago. Now, that scenario is pretty much unthinkable. Internal conflict in the Arab world means that their armies are mostly dysfunctional, at least in terms of launching foreign invasions. Their leadership needs to be concerned with their own internal problems. Their resources need to be directed to civilian needs. And the only place that money can come from is military budgets. Not only that, you have an Arab world consumed by Shiite-Sunni divisions, the Shiites under the leadership of Iran, the Sunnis under the leadership of Saudi Arabia. The Syrian conflict did not start that way. It started as an uprising against a tyrannical government, but in some measure that's what it's evolved into. This is not let me be clear, a stable environment. But it is not necessarily an environment that poses an immediate security threat to Israel. Hence, the budget cuts. Who made these budget cuts? The leaders of the state of Israel and its military generals. The army is becoming a much smaller army. 4,500 officers are being retired. Focus will be less on ground forces, more on air forces and technology. And of course, Israel has economic issues of its own. Its leaders looked at government expenditures, as leaders do. They saw the only way that money could be found to address social needs was to reduce the defense budget, and they came to the conclusion that was the right thing to do. Now, what are the other positives that we're going to cover tonight before we have some discussion? Relations with American Jews, some movement, some modest movement, but nonetheless some movement on issues of religion and state and economic reform, and then finally we'll say something about peace talks with the Palestinians. Let's begin with relations with American Jews. Israel has very strong support among the American people. That support now is about as strong as it has ever been. They do this comparative survey, who you're more sympathetic with, Israel or the Palestinians. A few months ago that was done. The numbers were something like 64% sympathetic with Israel, 11% sympathetic with the Palestinians, something like that. Israel has especially strong support among evangelical Americans. Her most important supporter and friend, however, has been the American Jewish community. Now, there's been a great deal of discussion in recent years as to whether or not there's been a decline in that support. Again, many prophets of doom in our midst in the Jewish world. I've always had my doubts about these claims. I think they've mostly been based on anecdotal evidence, and it's not something that I have seen in my very, very extensive travels. In any case, I was putting together all of this material, and then little did I know that 2 weeks before this lecture, we would have a major survey of American Jewish opinion. It was done by the Pew Research Center. Some of you may have seen some references to that. Just came out a couple weeks ago, and they have one section, Chapter 5, which is devoted to the question of Jewish Americans and their attitudes towards Israel. So obviously, let's spend a minute on that. My reading of the data is the numbers are very strong in terms of support for Israel. I think there's a reason for optimism on three fronts. First, Jewish Americans simply remain very devoted to Israel. 69% of American Jews say that they are either very attached to Israel or somewhat attached to Israel. 87% of American Jews say that caring about Israel is important or essential to their being Jewish. 85% of American Jews say that U.S. support for Israel is at the right level or should be greater than it is. 43% of American Jews say they have traveled to Israel. I don't really believe that number. But, I mean, it's a very high number. And the fact that people are expressing that sentiment at all suggests attachment. Now, the second point is, while older Jews are more attached to Israel than younger Jews, the number for younger Jews are really quite good. The differences are not that significant. Much of this is undoubtedly related to the birthright program. And the third factor is that attachment to Israel is strong. Now, this is interesting. Pay attention to this. Is strong despite the fact that many American Jews disagree with the policies of the current government. 38% of Jews believe that the current government is making a sincere effort to bring about peace, while 48% do not. So you have a plurality, not insignificant plurality, who oppose what the current government is doing. It's basically 50% opposed and 40% support. Another question, 14% say settlement building helps Israel's security, while 44% say that it does not. And the rest either don't know or say it doesn't make any difference. Now, some people are troubled by these numbers. I'm not particularly troubled by them. I mean, putting aside the substantive issues, what we'll deal with later. What it demonstrates to me is that American Jews know how to make reasonable distinctions. They can oppose a particular government or a particular policy while remaining closely tied to the Jewish state. What this shows to me, I think, is an American Jewish community that's mature and sophisticated and with a large measure of good sense. It isn't a question of I disagree with the policy and therefore I hate Israel. It's precisely and exactly the opposite. Now, first of all, I want to say that not everybody shares my optimistic reading of these numbers. Not so much because of the last point I mentioned, but some professional pollsters say that there has been a decline in intensity of commitment to Israel. For example, the numbers of Jews who are attached as opposed to very attached and so on. In any case, I wanted to share that with you. It's not my point of view, but that view is held. This is the reality, as I see it. At a time when many Jews are drifting away from religion and drifting away from God, if you look at the broad results of the study, and Jewish bonds are weakening, ties to Israel remain remarkably robust. Now, one other point deserves to be mentioned here. While American Jews are divided on how they see Israel's policies on peace, as I said, it's roughly 50-40, they are overwhelmingly unsympathetic to how the Palestinian Authority is handling peace issues, overwhelmingly unsympathetic. Only 12% believe that the Palestinian Authority is doing all that it can to advance peace. So, again, American Jews, not automatically supportive of Israel's policy positions, but doubts about Israel's positions do not translate into an embrace of the positions of Israel's counterparts in the peace negotiations. American Jews have yet to be convinced that Palestinians are serious about moving toward peace, even though they're divided about Israel's own policies. A sophisticated picture. Now, let's turn to some recent developments in the religious and economic realm. Israel is a modern industrial democracy with a religious system that is very much in need of reform, repair, and rejuvenation. Israel, by the way, let's clear this up. Israel is not a theocracy. Every now and again, somebody will suggest Israel is a theocracy. Iran is a theocracy. A theocracy is a system where ultimate political power is in the hands of religious leadership and not political leadership. And religious leadership is supreme, superior to political decisions made by elected political leaders. And Israel is exactly the opposite. Israel has a thriving, vibrant parliamentary democracy whose representatives are freely elected. Parliament is supreme. However, Israel's parliament has conferred authority over religious matters to a government-sponsored religious establishment. There's a Jewish religious establishment for Jewish citizens, headed by the Orthodox Chief Rabbinate. There's also a Muslim and a Christian religious establishment for those elements of the population. The Chief Rabbinate in the Jewish realm has total control over marriage, divorce, conversion, other issues related to personal religious status. If you're a Jew and you want to be married in Israel today, the only way to do it legally is to be married by a government-recognized Orthodox rabbi. If you want to be legally married by civil authorities, that is, have a non-religious wedding, or by a non-Orthodox rabbi, Reform or conservative rabbi, you have to go outside of the country for it to be legally recognized. You can be married by a Reform rabbi if you want, but it would have no legal status. If you want to marry a non-Jew, you have to go outside of the country. Or if a Christian wanted to marry a Muslim, you'd also have to go outside of the country. To state the obvious, this is not a system that makes sense. How could this happen? How did this come into being? When, after World War I, the British took responsibility for Palestine, they did what they had done elsewhere in their colonial possessions. They set up a religious authority. Now, for the Jews, this meant the Chief Rabbinate. From the British point of view, it meant that the British, didn't have to deal with day-to-day religious affairs, take that responsibility on themselves. They had no desire to do that. And at the same time, it gave them a measure of control over the local population. Now, the question was, when the State of Israel was established in 1948, why did they maintain the Chief Rabbinate, which was really a foreign-created, initially foreign-sponsored colonial structure, rather than something that was more organically Jewish. And keep in mind that Israel's founders were anti-religious socialists. Now, so what is the reason? We're not going to spend a lot of time in this. We could spend several hours on this alone. But first of all, the founders of Israel were convinced that religion had no future, that it would not survive more than a generation or two. They believed this with all their hearts. That being the case, they didn't think the decision to continue with the structure of the chief rabbinate was terribly important. Another factor, there were several Orthodox parties. The socialist leadership wanted their support on a number of issues. And keep in mind also, there were no reformer conservative Jews. This was not discrimination against reformer conservative Jews in 1947 and 1948. They did not exist in the state of Israel at that time. Also, keep in mind, the chief rabbinate at that time had a more or less moderate outlook. And so the chief rabbinate was maintained, but Ben-Gurion, what Ben-Gurion thought, the first prime minister, what he thought would happen did not happen. Religion did not disappear. It became stronger, and in some quarters, more extreme. Traditional religious sentiment grew. The issue here has nothing to do with Orthodox Judaism, a vibrant and valid expression of Jewish religious life. The issue was and is a government-sponsored religious monopoly, in this case an Orthodox one, with certain coercive powers over the lives of Israel's Jewish citizens. I would argue that there is not really a single example in the history of humankind of a coercive, government-sponsored religious monopoly that has succeeded in advancing the cause of the religion that it purports to represent. And why should Israel be any different? So this is a system that is not sustainable. So why do I say that? There are approximately 300,000 Israeli citizens, most of them Russian immigrants or the children of Russian immigrants, some from other Eastern European countries, who see themselves as Jewish but who are not considered Jewish today by the chief rabbinate. Perhaps in many cases they have Jewish fathers rather than Jewish mothers. In some cases perhaps because they don't have appropriate documentation. They are not permitted to be married legally in the state of Israel today. If they want to be married, they have to go abroad. It is impossible to imagine that the state of Israel will remain the only modern, industrialized democracy in which a substantial number of its own citizens cannot be legally married in their own homeland. Just impossible to imagine that. In the final analysis, Israelis are too sensible for that. Furthermore, many Israeli Jews who can be married in Israel are refusing to do so as an act of protest. Young people don't like being told what to do. Estimates range between 10 and 12% on the low end, 15, 17% on the high end of people who simply will not go along with the system. They go to Cyprus to get married, they go elsewhere abroad, they go to a lawyer to draw up some kind of an agreement, and they don't marry at all. Again, this is not sustainable, either as a matter of values or of human rights, or as a practical necessity. And it will change. Within a decade, this is what I wrote 3 days ago, and I'm going to update it. Within a decade, and perhaps sooner, we will see civil marriage in Israel. Yesterday, one of Israel's major party, the second largest party in the state, introduced a bill that is in essence a civil marriage bill, introduced it to the Knesset, called Brit Zugiyut Ezrachit, which means a civil partnership bill, introduced yesterday. And what it allows for is civil marriage, both for heterosexual couples and for homosexual couples. This is a party, the Yesh Atid party, we're going to talk about that. It is in the coalition, which is a center-right coalition. And it's not going to pass. It's not going to pass. However, I want to suggest to you, I had said 10 years. Maybe I'm going to revise that down now. My feeling is that in the Knesset, which has 120 people, it could get maybe 40 to 50 votes. That's very significant. Why wouldn't it pass? It's interesting because there are 10 or 11, I have to check, 10 or 11 representatives of Arab parties who we generally consider part of the left in Israel. And on political issues, will vote left. The Arab parties will not support this. Why not? Because it permits homosexual unions. And from a traditional religious perspective that they bring to the issue, they think that's wrong. So they would be against. Under those circumstances, the law won't pass. But it will garner significant support more than ever before. And I find that to be very encouraging, very hopeful. And we should note in passing, let's not misread the religious realities in Israel. Israel has a backward religious establishment, less than enlightened religious parties, and a strong secular anti-religious strain in the general population. There's also a moderate middle. My premise is Israelis are actively searching for the spirituality, the idea that Israel has the first Jews in all of Jewish history to have no need for religious Judaism in all its richness and diversity. That's just an absurd idea. We see in a dramatic way, and I'm not going to take the time, there are many, many indications of a search for an appropriate religious Judaism. It has no clear religious focus, no denominational tie, but there is a desire to give expression to a deep yearning for religious meaning. And I'll just leave you with this two little tidbits. A survey after this past Rosh Hashanah indicated that 500,000 Israelis went to high holiday services at Reform or conservative synagogues. Now, what's interesting about that number, it is absolutely untrue. Absolutely untrue. Reform and conservative movements do not have anywhere near the capacity to deal with that number of people. And about 2 years ago, there was a survey in which 30% of people said that they had been to a Reform or conservative service at some point. Also, absolutely not true. That would be almost 2 million people, 1.8 million people. Did not happen. So why do they answer like that? Because they know they should be in synagogue at least occasionally. And if they were to go, they think that the liberal synagogue is the place that they'd like to be, liberal here broadly defined. And it's extraordinary, in fact, so many Israelis are declaring their connection to religious movements that are largely unknown to them. And the ultimate answer to the distortions that flow from this religious bureaucracy that doesn't work, like all religious bureaucracies tend to do, is to create grassroots religious alternatives. And by the way, the greatest beneficiary to an open and free religious market in Israel would be Orthodox Judaism, without question. Reform and conservative movements are small, rather marginal at this stage, growing, but still rather marginal. The benefits of a creative and vibrant grassroots religious movement at this point would unquestionably be in the direction of more traditional forms of Judaism, a point that I've made with my Orthodox friends, some of whom, off the record, will say they agree. All right. Let's talk about one other religious issue, one that needs to be addressed immediately. And that is the question of army service. Army service. In the 1970s, there were 800 Haredim, it means God-fearing. Ultra-Orthodox is the term that is often used. And those are people who, generally speaking, their distinctive dress, black dress, is what identifies them, the general population. They live separate in large measure from the broader population in their own neighborhoods, in their own areas. In the 1970s, 800 Haredim were exempted from army service if they chose to do full-time yeshiva study as adults. So you could make that choice and get out of the army up to the number 800. The original number was 400, which Ben-Gurion agreed to in the early 50s. It was raised in the 70s to 800. Today, anybody know what that number is today? Want to guess? 58,000. How did that happen? In 1977, the previous limit of 800 was set aside because that's when Menachem Begin won the election unexpectedly because of the many problems that the Labor Party had, their problems with in how they dealt with Edot HaMizrach, with the Jews from Arab lands, the problems with how they had conducted the Yom Kippur War. So the voters of Israel rejected the Labor Party, which had been the only party that had governed Israel in the first 20 years of its history. They replaced it with, gave the most votes to Menachem Begin's party of the right. It's now called the Likud. And the Likud, in putting together a coalition, needed the ultra-Orthodox Jews who had been in coalition with Labor to jump sides and come in to coalition with them. And so one of the conditions for them doing so was that you lift the limit on the number of people who would be exempt from the army if they did full-time yeshiva study. And from that time, and I don't think that Begin, let's give him credit for this, was aware that this was the likely development, virtually all Haredi young men began to make the choice to evade army service. And they do this because their rabbis tell them to, because the rabbis want to keep them away from what they consider to be the contamination of secular life. There are a limited number of Haredim who serve now in the army, maybe 2,000 to 3,000. But the rest no. So for the great majority of Israelis, this is a cause for outrage. Israel is a country surrounded by enemies where most young men and many young women serve, postponing their education and their professional prospects. It's an enormously sensitive matter. It is also an economic disaster. To stay out of the army, you study in the yeshiva until you're in your early 30s. Then, even if you want to work, you have no training, you have no education. And many simply end up staying on in the yeshivot. Unemployment among Haredim is about 51, 52%. Israel is a small country. It cannot afford to have so many of its citizens avoiding productive work and supported by everybody else. According to all of Israel's leading economists, this is Israel's greatest economic problem. The high unemployment among Haredim, also among Israeli Arabs. That's a separate issue. I don't know if we'll have time to deal with that. So Yair Lapid, who's the finance minister, the head of the Yesh Atid party, said his campaign in the election in January was, they need to serve in the army. This is not anti-Haredi, he said. This is pro-Haredi. We're going to integrate them into the broader society rather than watch them distance themselves more and more from the Israeli mainstream. And we're also, he said, going to reduce subsidies for those who do not work so that after the army they'll have more incentive to find productive employment. And then he pretty much delivered on what he said. Something politicians don't do a lot of, but in this case, subsidies have been reduced with the result that yeshiva enrollment actually went down in September. And the state of Israel has come close to adopting a new draft law, had several readings in the previous Knesset. It needs one final reading in the current Knesset. It's expected to pass. Yeshiva students will be obligated to serve at age 21, either in the military or in civilian service. Nobody really has an issue with that. Exemptions will be no more than 1,800 per year, more than Lapid wanted, but that's out of 9,000 people who become eligible per year. So that means more than 7,000 would serve. So there is a potential here for an extraordinary revolution which is both a religious revolution and an economic revolution. Now, why only potential? Here's the not-so-good news. Because, first of all, the Haredim are entering the army at 21 rather than 18. Everybody else enters at 18. This is not a good thing. Many of them will be married by 21. They'll have to have children, which is fine. People should get married and have children. But first of all, pay in the Israeli army is determined by your personal status and your marital status and how many children you have. So it'll be vastly more expensive. But more important, the whole premise of the law is to expose a sheltered population to the broader society before minds are closed and patterns are set. It'll be much harder to get people into the army at 21 than it would be at 18. Another problem is the sanctions that you face if you don't do it, according to the law as it's now written, are criminal sanctions. I think that's a bad idea. If you don't go into the army because your Rebbe says you shouldn't go into the army, you go to jail. Why? I mean, it's kind of a bizarre coalition here. I mean, in terms of people who support that. Why do I think that's a bad idea? Because Israel is not going to arrest 9,000 people and put them into jail. It just isn't going to happen. The only sanctions that make sense are financial sanctions against the yeshivot. And finally, and this is the most troubling of all, the law doesn't go into effect for 4 more years. Now, what's going to happen before 4 more years? Another election. Another election. So will the next time around, when there's coalition bargaining, one of the parties say, you need us for the coalition, we will come in on the condition you defer this law? And the answer is maybe. Now, there are many Israelis who say, look, tremendous progress here. We never thought that such a law would be possible. One way or another, we are not going back to where we were because the people of Israel, again, basically sensible, will not stand for it. And I hope they're right. On a certain level, I'm pleased by what's happened, but there are question marks out there in terms of how this will be implemented. Okay. I'm not going to talk about Women of the Wall. If you have questions, maybe we'll deal with that, but we don't have a great deal of time, so I just now want to spend a few minutes on peace negotiations with the Palestinians and suggest to you why, on a certain level, I think there's some reason for optimism. There are not a lot of optimists out there, but I'm among them. Now, generally speaking, if an administration is going to make an effort to promote peace, it waits until the end of its term, and even then, if there's progress, it runs out of time. But somewhat surprisingly, Secretary John Kerry made the opposite choice. He decided to make Israeli-Palestinian peace a priority at the very beginning of this administration's second term. Now, virtually every expert said to him, don't do it, it will fail, neither side is ready, you can't be more pro-peace than the parties themselves, the administration has other priorities. It will be a political graveyard for you, as it has been for so many others. Don't do it. And he did it anyway. I thought it was a courageous decision. I thought it was the right decision. I thought it was an absolutely necessary decision. On June 3rd of this year, Kerry outlined the reasons why he had decided to proceed in a speech to the American Jewish Committee. Didn't receive a lot of coverage. It was a very important speech, a very good speech. You can find it on the website of the American Jewish Committee. Kerry, by the way, has impeccable pro-Israel credentials, all of which were on display in that speech and in other talks. And he also has good credibility with the Palestinian side. Now, if we look at that speech and everything else that he has said and all the various briefings, some on the record and some off the record, that have been given over the last 3 to 4 months, what is it that Kerry is saying? He is saying Abbas wants and needs peace. The head of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, he is a partner for peace. He's saying the Arab League is playing a positive role. Kerry is very proud of the fact that he himself negotiated with the Arab League a revision of their peace plan, which they had put forth originally in 2002, which was, well, we'll recognize Israel, but more or less, it's take it or leave it. based on 67 borders, and not only that, even implying there shouldn't even be any negotiations. That was not going to be in any way a basis for any actual peace. But in his dealings with them, he got them to allow for specific adjustments in borders. In other words, for the possibility of land swaps, providing backing and cover for the Palestinian Authority if that ultimately was the way that an agreement would go. And everybody realized if there's going to be an agreement, that's what's going to happen. There'll be trade-off on territories. Kerry has also said, the administration has said, the situation cannot remain static. If there's not a peace agreement, the result will be disaster for both parties in the region. And he has very specifically outlined, he said, look, what's going to happen? We don't get a peace agreement. He said, one possibility is the Palestinian Authority will collapse, turning the West Bank back to Israel. Israel will then be responsible for the economy and for security, creating a problem that's both practical and political. There are 9 battalions of PA security forces that currently work with Israel's army in maintaining security in the West Bank. What happens when they walk away? Another possibility, very different. The Palestinian Authority will not collapse at all. It'll go to the UN and the International Criminal Court. It's entitled to do so because of its enhanced UN status. And given what's going on in the settlements, the likelihood is they'll get a lot more support than Israel will. The United States will stand by Israel, but they might be standing there alone. And the underlying premise here is the only solution is a two-state solution, 2 states for 2 people, 2 peoples. And while it is possible, what we hear from the administration is some sense of urgency. If we don't have it now, the danger is the whole area is going to collapse into chaos. Now, the talks have begun. The Secretary of State called for concluding them in 9 months. We're about 3 months into it. They're operating under a blackout. We don't know the precise details, although unofficially there is evidence that they're not going too well. Many thought that security and border issues were relatively easy, while the ideological issues of Jerusalem and refugees were the most difficult. So far, it really hasn't worked out that way. Will there be peace? In my gut, it's hard for me to believe that they're really going to reach an agreement. What's interesting and sadly ironic about this conflict, apart from the fact that it's existed for 100 years, is that if there's going to be an agreement, both sides know exactly what it will look like. If a settlement comes, there will be tweaks here and there, and I don't dismiss the sensitivity and the difficulty of these issues, but basically we know what a settlement will look like. And the question is there a willingness to pay the price on both sides? On the Palestinian side, the Palestinians have never been able to do the 2 critical things that they need to do. Say the conflict is over with this agreement, once and for all, and say that Palestinian refugees are not returning to the state of Israel. Jerusalem is important, very important, sensitive, difficult. These issues that I just mentioned, I think, are more important and really at the heart of the matter. Will the Palestinians be able to do now what they have been unable to do up to now? I just don't know. I do not believe, by the way, in the theory of equivalence. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying, that somehow there is equal responsibility on both sides. I don't see it that way. Looking over the history of the conflict, there were clear points along the way when Israel had political leaders committed to peace and prepared to deliver peace, as difficult as that might have been. And they signed a peace agreement with Egypt and with Jordan, and they evacuated the Gaza Strip. On the Palestinian side, at the critical moments, the Palestinian leadership could not deliver. The watershed date was 2000, Camp David. The Americans were committed. The Europeans were supportive. The Arab League offered tacit, if not enthusiastic, support. Yasser Arafat could not make the historic decision that would have changed history. The deal was not yet on the table, but rather than endorse the process and move forward, he backed away and endorsed terror. It was a tragedy in every sense. It was a historic opportunity lost, and in addition, it decimated the Israeli left, which to this day has not recovered. To this day has not recovered. It's the center today that leads the efforts for peace. Now, President Abbas rejects terror. He is, in that regard, a true moderate. He cannot be seen as somebody who endorses or accepts the use of terror in the conflict. But the issue is, does he have the political strength and the determination to rally Palestinian forces to accept peace? The answer to that is I just don't know. And on the other side, will Prime Minister Netanyahu be able to do what he needs to move things forward, most important to stand up to the settlers and their representatives, those in the government and on the outside, both those who oppose the settlement altogether and those who believe that by some magic, the passage of time will somehow improve Israel's situation? Will he be able to stop building settlements, especially outside of the settlement blocks, that will remain part of Israel? Again, I don't know. The Prime Minister is politically brilliant, not always politically courageous. If a peace deal were on the table, there would be a political majority for it in Israel. But in order to get it on the table and win support for it, he would have to be prepared to take on his base and to do what all other Israeli prime ministers since Oslo have done, every single one. Rabin, Barak, Sharon, Olmert, all were prime ministers who changed direction after having become prime minister and broke with a lifetime of caution in order to create possibilities for peace. There has been some movement from Prime Minister Netanyahu. Has there been enough? Has there been enough? And what happens if talks fail? What happens if the Israelis are ready for peace and the Palestinians are not? It's certainly a possibility. What should Israel do? In my view, there's only one option only. If Israel is to keep the two-state solution alive, avoid the disaster scenarios outlined by Secretary Kerry, it needs to follow the advice of Ehud Barak, former prime minister and defense minister, and implement a unilateral separation coordinated with the United States. A unilateral separation, not really a unilateral withdrawal. In other words, set provisional borders, end settlement on the eastern side of the security fence, outside of the blocks, maintain a military presence as needed for security on the eastern side of the fence, but begin a gradual process of withdrawing settlements outside of the blocks. This will enable Israel to maintain its diplomatic standing with the United States, will avoid a crisis with Europe, will provide the Palestinians with the incentive to make decisions that they have to make to bring the conflict to an end. I prefer, despite all this, to remain optimistic. There will be a bridging proposal that will be put forward by the United States. Both sides fear this, but it's coming. And this is really the key. This is an extraordinary possibility that may not recur. Kerry is committed and serious. He's not going to walk away. He's made this his signature initiative. The international climate is favorable. This is why I thought he did the right thing, in a way that we have never seen previously in all of Israel's history. Now, this is to some extent an arguable point, and those on the right wing say, with crises all around, you can't ask us to make commitments. How do we know who'll be in power in any Arab country in 5 years? And the answer to that is provided by those in the government who support the peace negotiations, people like former Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni, and others who say, look, when we made peace with Egypt in 1979, Israel's right-wingers said, don't do it. Who knows what will be? We can't trust them. And meanwhile, the peace has lasted for 35 years, and even a president from the Muslim Brotherhood, Mohammed Morsi, respected that peace and even strengthened it in some ways after the war in Gaza, even though he wouldn't have signed it in the first place. So Livni says, would Israel have been better off not signing a peace treaty with Egypt 35 years ago, receiving the same advice then that we receive now? And her answer is, of course not. And the Arab League, as we mentioned, and its major patron, Saudi Arabia, are now favorable to an Arab-Israeli peace. Why? Is it because they're Zionists? Is it because they have this great love for Jews that has welled up in their hearts? And the answer is no. But they're engaged in a battle with Iran, in the battle between Sunnis and Shiites that is consuming the Arab world, provides them with an incentive that they did not have before. All these sort of bizarre stories in the press about de facto cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Israel on Iran, this is an overstatement. But there is an overlap of interest that's clear. Also, the Palestinian Authority has been greatly strengthened. Its enemy is Hamas, its enemy in the West Bank, its enemy in Gaza, which has been its competitor, and always threatening to overthrow and overtake their rule, not only in Gaza but in the West Bank. It is an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood. With the fall of Morsi, Hamas is in desperate straits and in no position to question a peace agreement. So what the current unrest in the Arab world has really done is to make clear to everyone what we've always known, that the Arab-Israeli conflict is not the central problem of the Arab world, not now and not before. And with every major Arab country scrambling to deal with its own interests, the Palestinian-Israeli struggle has been reduced to its natural dimensions. We can see it for what it is, a national conflict between two small national movements fighting over one rather small piece of real estate. For some, this is an excuse to ignore the conflict, but in fact, the opposite is true. This would be the moment to resolve that conflict, to get it off the agenda, to deal with the turmoil in the region by having Israelis and Palestinians collaborate to build a modern, secular, and westernizing state in the West Bank. This, I believe, is the perspective of our government. I believe it's correct. Let us hope that the Palestinians, who've been persistently rejectionist in pursuing their national aspirations, can understand this now. And as they establish their state, let us hope they can find a way to welcome the Jews to the neighborhood. And let us hope that the leaders of Israel, who too have responsibility for the current situation, can accept and embrace what the entire world and most Israelis know, that there will be a Palestinian state that will offer an answer to the plight of the Palestinian people, and Israel, both embracing Zionist principles and coldly calculating Zionist interests, must help to make that happen. So again, I prefer optimism. For too many people in America, in Israel, and the Palestinian territories, there is no hope, no future. But I don't believe that we must accept or prepare for permanent war. I prefer the Yitzhak Rabin vision of peace from which there is no retreat, no road back. Yes, while the road ahead is full of terrible dangers, the road back, the road to yesteryear, leads only to oblivion. And I refuse to give up on this dream, on this legacy. I believe it is shared by soldiers weary of fighting, by mothers and fathers weary of weeping, and by Jews and Palestinians weary of a terrible history of blood. Our task as concerned Americans is not to squander this inheritance. Our task is to guard it, nurture it, and grow it into a treasure for future generations. So I thank you very much. And
what is taught to the Palestinian children in schools, can that be changed? Their hatred from Israel, which is taught in the schools.
Look, the incitement issue is a serious issue. I mean, we Jews take education very seriously. It's not a reason not to proceed, or I don't think fundamentally undermines the principles that I laid out. When Sadat went to Jerusalem, the incitement that existed in Egyptian society was terrible. And what we learned with Sadat was, when you have leadership that's prepared to project this vision of peace, that new political possibilities enter the picture. Precisely what's happening on the ground in terms of incitement, it's hard to say. There was a major report that was done 6 to 8 months ago. The essence of it was, it's not as bad as people say. I didn't find a whole lot of comfort in that. But what I was talking about were fundamental interests. What we need to avoid is a situation of chaos and instability where things just continue down the current path. So one possibility is that there will be a vision of peace and an actuality of peace. The other, as I suggested, if it can't happen, and maybe that would be a reason, the other is Israel needs to take steps to separate so that we don't have the course that the Secretary of State outlined, and I think would be very detrimental to Israel's interests and to the visions of the Israeli people about what they expect their future to be. Let's be aware of the problem. Let's not let it push aside all the other good and appropriate considerations that we need to keep in mind as we look to the future. This notion of whether or not there should be Jews who live in the Palestinian state, a fair issue, an absolutely fair issue. My take on that issue is, very simply, there's no reason in the world why, if you have a Palestinian state and a Jewish state, just as the Jewish state has Jewish citizens, the Palestinian state shouldn't, that the Jewish state has Arab citizens, why shouldn't a Palestinian state have Jewish citizens? So it seems to me legitimate to raise that and for that to be a component of these negotiations. Part of the difficulty we have here is that the settler populations who live outside of the blocks, everybody acknowledges that a significant part of the settler population will remain in Israel, and the Jewish state is part of, a territorial swap. But the issue is, what about those settlements that are in an area that clearly would be part of the Palestinian state? I see no reason why Jews shouldn't stay there, but they have to be prepared to be citizens of the Palestinian state and to be under the authority of the Palestinian government. So if they are prepared to do that, why not? Why shouldn't you have an equality of status in that regard? But let's tell the truth here. The settlers who would be impacted have made it very clear they have no intention whatever of living under Palestinian authority. That when they say they're going to stay, they say they're going to stay in a Jewish government. And so that's the issue. Not for those in the blocks, but for those in what we would call the ideological settlements. Now, if all of the settlers are going to stay put, then you can't have a Palestinian state. And then we're right back to where we started. So let's assert the fact that Palestinians should be prepared to have Jews living in their midst. But Jewish settlers who are going to stay have to be prepared to be part of a Palestinian political entity and not somehow to remain citizens of a Jewish state, which will have a border now that will be to the west.
Is there any evidence that greater recognition of Reform and conservative Jews in Israel is actually going somewhere? And at the end of the day, if conservative and Reform Judaism gained greater recognition in the state of Israel, if, for example, Reform and conservative Jews could get married by a Reform and conservative rabbi in Israel, would that in any way increase the number of American Jews who actually want to live in Israel?
Those are two different things. The number of American Jews who want to live in Israel is going to be rather modest. I think we should encourage those who want to make that choice. And again, there will be some. In terms of the future of Reform and conservative Jews, the point that I'm making here is it's a slow process. We shouldn't think in American terms with an American mentality. In this country, Reform and conservative Jews together are the overwhelming majority of the affiliated community. Orthodox Judaism is still maybe about 20% of the affiliated community, which means Reform and conservative is about 80%. The reality in Israel is the movements are small. And so it's going to take time. It's not going to be 2 years or 3 years or 5 years where we're going to see great, dozens of huge reform and conservative centers that are thriving in every major city. But make no mistake about my intention. I think it is let me speak as a Reform rabbi. Conservative rabbis can speak for themselves. I have no particular reason to believe that they have different views. We absolutely must establish ourselves in Israel. If we don't do so, we will have moved to the margins of Jewish history. The notion that Reform Judaism, liberal Judaism, progressive Judaism is simply a regional sectarian American phenomenon that does not have a place in the greatest stage of the Jewish people, in the land of Israel, is totally foreign to my way of thinking. And, as I suggested, there's every reason to believe that Israelis are open to spiritual experience, are searching for religious communities, and while their Reform and conservative Judaism will not be exactly what we have here, it'll probably be very different, some dimension of the progressive religious experience will, I am convinced, make its way and take root in Israel. But it's going to take a little bit of time. We're going to have to be patient, and we absolutely must not give up on Israel while we're waiting for that to happen.
What's the future of Israel given the demographic difference in birth rates between the Arab population and the Jewish population?
Well, look, the future of Israel is if there are two states, either if there are two states, or in the absence of a peace agreement, you have the kind of separation where Israel says, okay, if you're not going to make peace, then we're going to make this separation anyway while retaining our, looking out for our security needs. And in those circumstances, the demographic situation is fine. The Arab population, if you look on the western side of that line, is about 20%, 20 to 22%. So Israel has a secure Jewish majority. Zionism is about establishing a Jewish and democratic state in the land of Israel. That's what it's about. And a Jewish state means a state with a secure Jewish majority. A democratic state means, what people think it means. In other words, all residents have equal rights. If you have a two-state solution, there is not a demographic issue for the foreseeable future. There's no reason to think, why you should have such a problem. If you don't have either two-state solution or some kind of a separation, you have a demographic issue right now. With Gaza, you have virtually an Arab majority now. Even without Gaza, you have a 40 or 45% Arab minority. Those are the demographic realities right now. So, as a lifetime Zionist, I simply can't accept that the options are either permanent occupation or one state where within the next 10 to 15 years, the Jewish population would be a minority. A Jewish state would cease to exist. That's not why the Zionist movement came into being. That's not why the Jewish people support the state of Israel. That is not what we look for in the future of the Jewish state. That's not what we hope for from Jewish sovereignty. So in that circumstance, in one circumstance you have a demographic problem, and in the other circumstance you don't. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.